My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK, and Dua Muhammad is at the control. And I'm here with you for 1 hour talking in the world of info. And in the world of info today, we have the world of books. And in the world of books, I decided to, celebrating the new year, to present two very interesting books that I think they deserve to be read. Well, the first book is by the famous professor Edward Said, and it's called Out of Place, a real, very interesting biography. And the second book by the famous journalist and writer Muhammad Hassanin Hekel, and it's called A New Visit to History. And this is really a very interesting book because it covers very important subjects that we'll talk to you about after the break. So stay tuned to Radio Cairo with the world of info, the world of books, and the book is Out of Place. So yes, we are back with the world of info. And today the talking about the world of books, and the book is Out of Place by Edward Said. Well, how to really emphasize the role of Edward Said as a real professor and a very dignified man who lived in the world for a very short, considerable short period, because I think he really had a lot of to say and a lot to do. Well, Edward Said was born in the year 1935, and unfortunately he passed away in the year 2003. And during his period, he had a very interesting life. And he has lived in a lot of places. Not one single of these places he really considered home. And the only time he felt that he really was living at home was only 6 months of his life in a place called Jerusalem. So let's talk about Edward Said. Edward Said was born to Hilda, who was born in 1914 in Palestine, particularly in Bethlehem, and his father was Wadia Said, and he was a businessman, and he married his mother in the year 1932-1933, and they had a first child who was stillborn, and then later on they had Edward as their first living child in 1935. After that he had 4 sisters. So why did he feel so much out of place? Let's talk first about Wadia Said. Well, Wadia Said was a businessman. He was a Palestinian gentleman coming from a well-bred family where he was born in Jerusalem in the late 19th century. And he has found out that he really need to immigrate outside the Palestine and go to the United States. And he traveled in the United States in the year almost 1911. And where he worked for some time during his trip with a friend on a ship, where he worked as a sailor, as a part-time waiter. And when he reached New York, he started looking for a career and for a life. And during this period, he was able to continue his studies, has a college degree, and started his own private business. Being a well-educated and a cultured man, he found a chance as well to join the American army that was sent to Europe. And he was sent to Europe in 1917 in the final year of the World War I, where he was, as he told his son, has been bombed with gas, and he has seen the trench fightings, and he went on to come back to the United States after that with a victorious army, and earned the American citizenship. He worked some time in America, and he was able to make a small fortune with which he returned back to Jerusalem. When he returned to Jerusalem, he decided that he will start his own business, owning a dealership of some of the very most important companies that produce typewriters. and he established his company, which was called Standard Stationery, with a branch in Jerusalem and a branch in Egypt. And so he was transferred his business, his main business, in Cairo, and found out that the Standard Stationery Company will make a good business for him, and he started earning good money. Then he decided that he will have to get married, and he found a beautiful wife, Hilda, who was born in Jerusalem, as I've just said, in 1914, and he got married to her when she was almost 16 or 17 years old, and he had from her these children. Hilda, being transferred to a country that she didn't know and to a city she didn't know, she had to rely on her aunt. Her maternal aunt, Milia Badr, was a very interesting lady. She, as a spinster, worked in a very important school that was started to be established in the early 20th century and was called the American College in Cairo for girls. And the American College for Girls was a very well-established school that was interested in teaching young girls. And it was a missionary school that belonged to the Protestant sect, which Milia and, of course, Wadia also as well were Protestants. And even Milia's, and even Hilda's father was also a priest. So Milia, knowing Cairo, was sort of a guide to her young niece in Cairo, helping her in finding the good places to live, where they started living in Zamalek, helping her to know people, getting her to know where to get good food or good tailors or whatever, and therefore, and to have a good education for her children. And strange enough, she decided, and in her way to help Hilda, that she shouldn't put her children to missionary schools. She wanted them to go to public English schools. And this is a very interesting story. And these English schools were the English school in Cairo, where she suggested that she put the girls in it, and Victoria College, where she suggested that she put her son, her only son, in Victoria College. At that time, Victoria College, as we once presented a book about Victoria College, was relocated to Cairo because of the World War I. And so it was relocated in Maadi, and later on this branch in Maadi was maintained. We know that its original place is in Alexandria, where it has a very beautiful campus, and it was built in the early 20th century. And later on, they made the new campus in Maadi, which is still there and still had a lot of students who were transferred from Alexandria during World War I. World War II to World War II, the new campus in Maadi. And this is where Edward Said learned his ABC and got his education, and he as well has understood and learned English very well. His mother was a very dedicated mother who was very much interested in culture and in reading, and she has given her son a lifetime of information and of culture, and giving him the chance to read a lot of interesting books. On the other side, the father was a great businessman who always tried to emphasize the important material world to Edward himself. We have also reached for both families, two other members of the Said family. Najla, his daughter, we presented her work and her beautiful book about Palestine, out of Palestine, of course, and or the Palestine that lives in her, that's Najla Said. And the second book by Jane Said Maqdisi, the sister of Edward Said, who has written a beautiful book about my grandmother, my mother, and me. And this also told about their life in Cairo and later on in Beirut and in the United States. So Edward Said started going to the Victoria College, where he got a good education. At the same time, he was bullied sometimes by macho young boys who were very much interested in sports, while he was very much interested in literature. And one of these boys was the head boy, and his name was Sarkis Shulhoub or Omar al-Sharif. Edward Said has mentioned a short story about how Omar al-Sharif, as a young boy and as a young head boy of the school, was always bullying the young boys who were not interested in sports. And this is very interesting. This is his only encounter with Omar al-Sharif. And then both men later on, perhaps maybe they have met, but both men were successful in their own field. Now let's take Edward Said in the school and take as well the time of the World War II, where the Germans approached Alexandria and reached Abd al-Alamein, and then they were defeated and went back. But Edward Said stayed in Cairo and stayed in the campus of the Victoria College in Maadi. He got his high school grade, but for some times before that, he had the chance to be transferred to Jerusalem, where he spent a semester in Western Jerusalem in 1947-48. And this was one of the most beautiful times in his life, where he lived in Jerusalem. He went to a school with his second cousins and cousins of the family from the maternal and the paternal side, and even the school teacher and the school headmaster were also family members. And this was maybe the only time that Edward Said felt that he was in the right place. That's an interesting story. After that, due to the 1948, the 15th of May, with the declaration of the State of Israel, and the start of the war of 1948, he was transferred again to Cairo, where he continued his work in his study in Victoria College. Also, the family received in their beautiful big house in Zamalek a lot of the family members who went from Jerusalem, and they were all coming from Western Jerusalem on their way back to the diaspora. Some of them stayed in Egypt, others went to the States or to Canada or to Australia, and the whole family started to get out of Palestine, finding or trying to find a place for themselves elsewhere. And they passed always through Wadia Said house, where Wadia helped all these members of this family, of his relatives, always tried to help them to find a better place for them, and to help them money-wise and connection-wise. So we can see that Edward, after that, graduating from the high school of Victoria College, his father decided to send him to the United States, where he is going to learn in a very prestigious school, and that's Princeton. And he graduated from there, and after that got his master and his PhD from Harvard University in 1964. He graduated in 1957, and then he later on went to Harvard, where he got his PhD in 1964. Actually, in 1963, he started teaching in Columbia University. So his encounter was with three important universities on the eastern side of the United States, where he got really a very highly advanced education. He found himself becoming a professor of comparative literature in Columbia's University, and he stayed there as a tenor for all his life. Edward Said his PhD was about Orientalism, and he has published this Orientalism in a beautiful a book that is considered to be one of his first 22 books that he published all through his life. He was always interested in dealing with the fact of Orientalism and trying to find a real explanation and understanding about Orientalism, and giving them the right way to understand how it should be. The fact that so he was a great critique of Orientalism, and his book is a book that deserves to be read, because he was looking on the other side of the coin of Orientalists, because a lot of Orientalists were biased, and this is what Edward Said made as his own crusade on letting the people understand that the Orientalists are not as we thought of their clear intentions. Well, stay tuned to us. We'll talk more about Edward Said book, beautiful book, Out of Place, after the break. So, we're still listening to the world of info, and today is the world of books. And yes, we are continuing our discussion about the famous book of the famous person, and really a real good gentleman. That is Professor Edward Said, and the book is Out of Place. In the early 90s, two things happened in the life of Edward Said. The first thing, which was really very important, and unfortunately very difficult situation, is that he has discovered that he is suffering from a leukemia, a disease that was definitely going to cause his death in a very soon period, in spite of the fact that he was on good treatment and in New York in a very important medical health care center, yet he knew from the very first moment that his life is doomed. And therefore, in 1991, for 12 years, he knew that death is coming soon. He decided in 1991 that he would have to write his experience as a Palestinian in diaspora, and to describe his situation as a man who lived out of place all through his life. He never felt really at home, whether this was in Cairo or in the United States of America, and the only time he felt at home was in the 6 months he lived in Jerusalem when he was just 12 years old. So he decided to write this book, and this book is a beautiful book of prose. He was able to finish it because he was going into attacks, exacerbations, and remissions of this terrible disease by the late 1999, and it was published in 2000. And it was a bestseller from the very first moment. The second important point is that he was involved as well in the Oslo agreement between the Palestinians and the State of Israel, and which was supposedly to become a peace accord, which was short-lived and full of unfulfilled promises for the Palestinians. He tried hard, and he had his famous love of classical music to a great friendship with Barenboim, the famous conductor, to form a real orchestral symphony that included Palestinian and Israeli players. Well, his hopes and aspirations of the life and improvement of the life of Palestinians and finding a real state of Palestine cannot be denied. But let's go back of how he felt all through his life. So he was carrying an American passport, and he never lived in the States until he was 18 years old. And he has seen for himself how it is to live and to try to see Palestine, which was never there. He took his children to go to see for themselves what is left of Palestine, and at the same time to go to Cairo as well. In this coming home trip, he went to Israel as an American citizen, and therefore definitely he was allowed in. And in the lead airport, he found the custom or the officer on the borders asking him a simple question. It's written here that you are born the place of birth, Jerusalem. Do you have relatives there? He said, no. Do you have a home in Jerusalem? Which was, of course, Western Jerusalem, where the family homes of his family, from his mother's side or from his father's side, have been confiscated long time ago in 1948. And so he said, no, I don't have a home. So the third question was difficult and a tough one. So why are you coming back? He said, I've just come back to see for myself. So there he was with his family, his daughter, Najla, and his son, Wadia, and his wife, who was also a Palestinian American, to visit Palestine or to visit Jerusalem for one more time. And after that also he made a visit to Cairo. And when he went to Cairo, he went to the home or the apartment that they were living in. And of course, long time they have left this apartment because his father also left Cairo and went between the Beirut and the United States of America. So he knocked on the door of the apartment, and the new tenant of the apartment opened the door, and with a very strange surprise, he looked at him and he said, "Yes." He said, "I once lived in this apartment." So the guy was definitely afraid that Edward might have come back to seek possession or repossession of the apartment. So it was another bad encounter. So Edward Said lived his life through all his life, writing books about diaspora, about Palestine, about the rights of Palestinians, and about the state of Palestine that never was materialized. And yet, this book remains to be a very beautiful part of, uh, of the prose. And I suggest that you should read this book, because if you read it, you'll find that yourself feeling a lot of empathy with Edward Said in all what he has written in this beautiful book. A bestseller, a book that deserves to be read, and definitely a mind-changing book by Edward Said, which is now 25 years later remains as a very important milestone in my reading and in my admiration to Edward Said. So, you're still listening to Radio Cairo. This is World of Info, and we're still coming to you from Studio 3. My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK. Dua Muhammad is at the control. Stay tuned to us, and we'll come back to you after the break. So, you're still listening to the World of Info. And yes, today is the second book of today, and really a book that deserves to be read. Why is it that important? A book by Muhammad Hassanin Hakel, the famous writer and journalist, who really had the chance of a lifetime of a journalist to be very near to the important people. He was a very close friend to President Nasser. And even before the revolution and before President Nasser, in a very young age, he was born in the year 1923. And in the early years, when he was 19 years old, he went to learn journalism in the Egyptian Gazette. He was a fluent speaker of English and had the chance to work in the Egyptian Gazette, which was an English newspaper published in Egypt by Egyptians. And he had the chance to become a military correspondent to this newspaper, and he was asked by his editor-in-chief to go and cover up for the Al-Alamein battle, which he did. And actually, it was a chance in a lifetime to see for himself the whole World War II and the new world order that was starting to come, because Al-Alamein was a marking milestone in the World War II. It was the first defeat of the Nazi forces and of the Axis forces, and it was the first successful victory of the Allies, which after the Alamein, the Allies have never seen a defeat, and after the Alamein, the Axis have never seen a victory until the war ended in Europe in May 1945, in the 8th of May, and later on in August, and the signing of the surrender of the Japanese in September, later on in September 1945. So the book is called A New Visit to History. And he's talking about interviews that he had the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And this is strange enough, because these were not just the interviews that he made with these very important historical characters and published at that time of these interviews, and that's it. No, he decided that he is going to write a resume of write these interviews, and his elaboration maybe 10 to 20 years after, or 30 years even after these interviews. And that's what makes the book interesting, because it's a visit to the interviews that he had. And the people he decided that he would go and visit his interviews that were made by him were very interesting books, interesting personalities of history. So who are these persons, and how much important are they to the history of the world? And this is definitely what is so interesting. There are very important historical people. There were Juan Carlos, the famous, and the new king of Spain. Andrew, that later on was the supreme commander of USSR, I mean the secretary of and the ruling important strong man of the Soviet Union just before the Gorbachev. Field Marshal Montgomery, Albert Einstein, Jawaharlal Nehru, the famous Prime Minister of India, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, the famous Shah of Iran, and David Rockefeller. Well, that's interesting. He has decided to take these historical people that he met in their epic of their power or their influence, and later on to elaborate on these interviews some years later. And some of these years are between, as I said, between 10 to 20 to 30 years. So let's go and find out what he has seen. The first one was Juan Carlos. And in Juan Carlos, he presented a real nice resume of the Juan Carlos and of the Spanish history, modern Spanish history, of how the kingdom was never abolished, and the king was never abolished during the reign of Franco, and how Franco was the general who was able to defeat the socialists and made a sort of allying with Hitler and with Mussolini, and was able to establish the new Spain, which was a dictatorship, but he was the one who was in control, and yet the nominal key was present. The king was present in exile, and that's the father of Juan Carlos. But he decided that he's going to omit that king, and he wanted his son to be the crown prince, and he's going to be the king after Franco dies. So this is a very strange arrangement that everybody thought that this will be the end of the kingdom of Spain, and that the influence of Franco will persist and has its own perseverance forever. And it's also very important to emphasize the role of Franco in the upbringing of Juan Carlos, because he has taken the king and this crown prince and said that he are not going to meet his father except for a very short period of time every year. And so the real king was in exile, and Juan Carlos, the prince, was almost in home exile in Spain, not allowed to have a lot of encounter with his father, so that his teacher will be always, and his patron will be always, Franco. But Juan Carlos proved to be a real man of the hour. How he was able to navigate his life through this period of preparation for the death of Franco, and how he has decided to become a democrat and a king who will always look to the authority of the people and of the democracy, and refuse the coup d'etat that happened in the early 80s when they tried to abort the democracy, especially when the famous prime minister, the famous Spanish prime minister, socialist prime minister, won the González won the elections, and they thought that he shouldn't rule because they were afraid of socialism. So he met Juan Carlos, and Juan Carlos was a very conservative man in this interview. So the interview has carried small amount of information, but the elaboration of Haeckel to Juan Carlos is really very good information, historical information that is needed. The second important interview was with Andropov. Andropov, who later on was the strong man after the death of Brezhnev and Cherenko, definitely is a very important period of time. It was for him writing these words. He said that he met Andropov, who was the director of the KGB during the tenure of Kosygin and of Brezhnev, And he met him several times with President Nasser in the very critical years of Egyptian history after 1967, when Nasser was trying to get new armaments of the Egyptian army and asking the Soviets to help him to defend his country and the world at that time, the Egyptian country at that time of the and the Russian or the Soviets supported Egypt in this period of time. And Andropov, who was a very bright, sharp man, and he talks less than he listens. And of course, this was the important character of a KGB director. And later on, Haeckel had the chance to meet him several times and discussed with him a lot of historical facts about Egypt and its complicated relations with the Soviet Union. The third important character in this interesting book was Field Marshal Montgomery. He heard of Montgomery when he was a young military correspondent in 1942 when he was 19 years old. But of course, he didn't meet Montgomery then. But later on, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Telegraph was a friend of Haeckel, and at the same time a very good friend of the Field Marshal Montgomery. And the year was 1967, and this was the earliest in May, the celebration of the Alamein battle, 25 years on the Alamein battle. And the editor-in-chief of the Daily Telegraph decided to approach Haeckel, to approach President Nasser, to allow Montgomery to come to the field of this famous battle and visit the battle itself. And therefore, Haeckel will have a chance in a lifetime to meet Montgomery and ask him for his elaboration of this historical fact. Well, Montgomery was not new for Egypt because in the early 30s of the 20th century, he was a commander of a battalion that was stationed in Mustafa Kemal camps in Alexandria, a British battalion there. And after that, we know that before 1936, there were only 6 British battalions in the whole of Egypt. One of them, the commander, was Montgomery. Later on, with the bad progress of the British Eighth Army, Churchill decided that he is going to get rid of Wavell and Acknowledge, and decided that Montgomery will be the commander-in-chief of the Eighth Army, and he was able to defeat the Germans in the Battle of Al Alamein. His encounter with Haeckel was always a strange encounter because Montgomery had a lot of questions to ask, more than the questions that Haeckel wanted to ask him about. He wanted to ask him, and this was before the 5th of June war. He wanted to ask him about 1956. He wanted to ask him about what President Nasser thinks of and what are the prospects of peace between Egypt and Israel at that time. And of course, there were a lot of questions that remained without answer. And he says in his interview how Montgomery thought of the building of the Iron Curtain, and of course his talking about Ike Eisenhower as a real politician more than being a distinguished military leader. And he was not a very big fan of Eisenhower. And of course, a lot of questions that was raised by Montgomery remain without answers. But just the idea to talk about a person who met Montgomery and sat with him, this was really interesting. And the fourth character that he has described was Albert Einstein. And this is a chance in a lifetime to meet Einstein in his whole self. And he was visiting as a young journalist in New York, and he met Dr. Mahmoud Azmi, who was the Egyptian representative in the United Nations. And he told him that if you have a chance to meet Einstein, you have to take it. So he approached Princeton University, where Einstein was a professor there, and he was granted an interview with Einstein. And the interview, as Einstein said, I'll be walking my daily walk on the garden near my home, and he can join me in this walk. And the interview became a double interview. A double interview because Einstein, as the most famous, brilliant scientist of the 20th century, with his discovery of the relativity, opened up to Haeckel and told him about his opinion of, first of all, of the nuclear bomb, his role in the nuclear bomb, that his relativity theory has proved without doubt that the atom can be there will be fission or division of the atom, and this can be really the mother of the atomic energy and the atomic bomb. And that he has written to Roosevelt a warning letter in the late 30s, early 40s, about the fact that Hitler will try to make the atomic bomb, and that the United States has to work hard on building its own bomb before Hitler is able to make it. And this advice that Roosevelt accepted and started forming the bomb. But his role in forming the bomb stops at that. It was the work of Oppenheimer, who was more under this fission of the plutonium and radium. So this is another important point. The other historical point, he was offered to become the president of Israel after Chaim Weizmann died. And he refused that. He said, although I am pro-Jewish because I am a Jew and I believe in the rights of the Jewish people to have their own country, but this will be on the account of another people living, and these are the Palestinians. And I don't want to see the Palestinians subjected to a lot of tyranny. And Haeckel explained to him that the Israelis have done a lot of atrocities to the Palestinians, and he said, I knew about that firsthand, and that's why I refused to become a nominal president of Israel after Chaim Weizmann. I believe in Ben Gurion, but I don't believe in politicians like Menachem Begin, who were involved a lot of terrorist activities. And he said to him, you should approach President Nasser, or at that time Nasser was the prime minister, and President Naguib, to try to them, I can be a mediator between Egypt and Israel to help to bring peace to the Middle East. Well, this was the offer of Einstein, and of course we know from history that Nasser was pro doing this sort of a peace treaty, but the Israelis were not accepting these borders of Israel and wanted to increase their borders and started sabotaging this peace plan in the early 1950s with the famous Lavon scandal. So Haeckel says it was a great encounter with Einstein, and I really felt that this man has a lot of human touch and human belief in the miracles that is called the human beings. So this is another interview of Haeckel. The other interview, which was with Jawaharlal Nehru, the prime minister, a very cultured man, a very educated man who went to Harrow College and to Oxford, and definitely his father, who was a very famous rich politician, sent his son to learn in the UK, and he came back with great culture and great education. His encounter with Nehru was not always positive. He met him in the early 50s and in the Bandung and in the famous Yugoslavia meeting as well, and he felt that Nehru was a timid person. He doesn't talk much. He has a lot of confidence in himself, and he doesn't open up easily. But his encounter with him later on in one of the meetings proved to him how this cultured, educating man has his own vision of what will happen to the non-allied movement and how things will happen and deteriorate in the countries that are liberated from colonialism, how they will feel trapped by the colonial powers who have really abused them and took a lot of their own money for some time, and therefore they will always try to keep them submitted, or by putting on puppets in the new countries that are made. He has described his final encounter with the famous Nehru on his deathbed, and how he opened up with him with a lot of discussions and a lot of explanation of what happened in India and the progress of strong relation between Egypt and India and the prospects of further advance of India as a country. And this was a real encounter that really made him feel how great this man was. And one of the final interviews was with Muhammad Rida Pahlavi, the famous Shah of Iran. And he said that he had two encounters with him. The first encounter was in 1953 at the post period of Mossadegh coup, and how he was able to return to power after Mossadegh short-lived regime was overthrown. And he found when he's in this interview how the Shah was a very incapable governor at that time, with lack of experience and lack of confidence in himself. And then later on, when he tried to negotiate starting of a relation or bringing back the relation between Nasser and the Shah in the late 60s. And then he received, although he has fallen from grace with Anwar Sadat, then he received an invitation in 1975 to meet the Shah Iran, who was strong, having one of the strongest armies in the area, in the Middle East, and had with him a great interview. But it was a guarded interview. He was not able to go on with this interview as much as he wanted, because he was not allowed to see the leaders of the opposition at that period of time, and he was not allowed to go much in depth in all the questions that he wanted. But he felt that there was something missing. So his encounter with Rida Pahlavi in his final years in power and empowerment. And the last but not least was his meeting with David Rockefeller, the great politician and the rich and the very rich tycoon and the very rich family, and the talk about authority and power in the United States, even at Reagan's time, and who is in control in power. Well, this book is a very interesting book, and it's really a book that deserves to be read. A New Visit to History by Albert Einstein, a book that deserves about Albert Einstein, of course, and about other people, by Muhammad Hassanin Heikel, a book that deserves to be read. A New Visit to History. So stay tuned to us. We are the World of Info. So by this, we come to the end of our program, the World of Info. And today was the World of Books. And I really wish you a very happy new year. My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK. Dua Muhammad was at the control. And today we had two interesting books, Out of Place by Edward Said and A New Visit to History by Muhammad Hassanin Heikel. Two interesting books that deserve to be read. I'm wishing you a very happy new year, and please stay tuned always to Radio Cairo, and we promise that we'll come back at the same time, same station next week. Stay tuned to Radio Cairo.